Now, the issue of migration is taking center stage in the United States in the run-up to November's presidential elections. This as the number of migrants arriving in the U.S. reached a record high at the end of last year. While political battle lines on border policies between Republicans and Democrats are well established in Washington, volunteers helping migrants trying to cross the border are losing hope that there is a political will to solve the problem on the ground. DW correspondent Benjamin Alvarez Gruber reports from the U.S.-Mexican border.
The California border town of Yacumba Hot Springs has become a flashpoint for migration. Thousands of people have crossed into the United States here in recent months, many of them from Latin America.
We're trying
it here now because most of Nicaraguans who crossed through Piedras Negras, they say they will send them back. Yes, that is why we're trying our luck here. We are here now. Suffering, but we are here. Border Patrol has paused and took children and mothers with them. They said they would pick us up in the morning.
These volunteers are helping them. Warm clothing after a rainy night and food. Many had no tents to sleep in. The next step is to wait for Border Patrol to pick them up for registration.
People get stuck here. Sometimes these days, usually only for a matter of hours. But there was times at least 6 weeks ago where people were here for 4 or 5 days in the same location.
Sam and his son John are locals. Along with other volunteers, they have been taking care of newly arrived migrants for months.
It leaves me very disappointed. It's quite frankly kind of absurd that my family and just a group of regular volunteers are filling in this role. It should be done by the U.S. government. There should be the Red Cross out here. There should be many different organizations, but they're just not here.
Daily, the volunteers scan the area along the border for people. The so-called San Judas break, a gap in the border fence used to pave the way for many migrants.
So this is a transit camp that was set up by the Mexican National Guard that was designed to halt any migrants that come through this gap over here. Prior to this establishment, we would see smugglers bringing people through non-stop throughout the day in cars, driving up and down this dirt road over there. They would pack sometimes up to 12 people in a single small SUV.
Volunteers say the strategy of deterring migrants does not work, because they will just search for other gaps as the legal ways of entry are limited. Sam and John don't get financial support from the authorities. They are disappointed, not just with Washington.
It's almost like they have given up on the visual PR aspects of it. They just don't care anymore. I mean, look at it. This has been going on for 6 months now. Steady, constant, and nobody, lots of talk, blah, 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 lots of talk, lots of media attention to the talk. But you seen anything change? I haven't.
Good news for this group of newly arrived migrants. After hours in the cold, Border Patrol came to pick them up. They will be registered, and a decision will be made on whether they can stay in the US or they will be sent back to their countries.
U.S. political analyst Boris Foran is with us now. He teaches political science at Bard College in Berlin. So, Boris, let's talk about the political side of all of this, because President Biden has failed to get Congress to pass legislation that addresses the migration crisis at the U.S. southern border. Why has it been so difficult to strike a deal?
Well, he hasn't been the first one to fail. There hasn't been any legislation, comprehensive legislation reform in the 21st century yet. There have been multiple attempts, starting with McCain and a few other McCain-Kennedy bill that sometimes at least achieved a bipartisan compromise in the Senate, but then failed in the House. And I think the main reason for that is very much tied to the political phenomenon that's sometimes described as polarization between the parties, but also within the parties. So this has been a major problem. And again, with Biden, the same is true. We know that Donald Trump also didn't want this bill to pass because he sees migration as a major issue and subject for his own campaign. I think that's one part of the story. Another part is also that the bill at the time was linked to aid to the Ukraine, which is a very contentious issue on the right in the House of Representatives.
And dealing with the issue of migration, I mean, it's held up many other issues, hasn't it? Or perhaps it's been used as an excuse also to hold up many other issues, such as vital military aid for Ukraine. Just walk us through the gridlock and how you're perceiving it.
Yeah, not just that. I mean, it is interesting that migration is such an important issue, not just in the US, actually. I mean, there has been a surge of global migration, of waves of migration in the last couple of years, especially with the beginning of the COVID pandemic, but also fueled by political instability in a lot of different contexts. For the US, what's particularly important is obviously the Latin American context. But what I would also emphasize is that we're seeing that the right, the extreme right in particular, is using migration as a wedge issue, as a policy issue to try and mobilize its voters. And this is something we're seeing not just in the US, we're seeing it in Europe as well. And we're seeing also that the center left is giving in. So there's a change in position, for instance, also in Germany, but also in Denmark earlier on. And we're seeing a similar development with Biden, where he's now trying to appear more tough on these types of immigration questions. But I think you're absolutely right. It's distracting from some of the issues such as lack of responsiveness of democratic institutions, deep inequalities, and a withering welfare state. So a lot of political issues that are basically swept under the rug by a focus on foreigners.
And we've heard that President Biden is thinking of using his executive authority to deny some migrants asylum claims. Can you walk us through what's going on there and whether the political issues now outweigh the humanitarian ones?
Right. So the border bill was a package of different things, also adding the Ukraine and financial support for Israel together, lumped together with the question of migration. And the border aspect is now something that Biden wants to deal with in an executive order. So he's basically bypassing Congress to do so. And again, I mean, I think we're in an election year. There's a lot of focus on Biden's position on migration, and I think he wants to take some of the momentum out of Trump's campaign by saying, well, the border bill failed because of the Republicans, and here's what I'm offering instead.
Let's talk a little bit more about Trump, because as we know, he is still currently the leading candidate to get the Republican nomination to run for president. He's stepped up this already strong anti-migrant rhetoric and is apparently mulling building mass deportation camps if elected. Just walk us through what the strategy is there and how you see that, affecting his base.
Well, in part, it's surprising because the language itself is radicalizing in the last couple of weeks and months. I mean, he spoke of the body politic and the American blood being poisoned. I mean, this is rhetoric that is reminiscent of fascism in Germany. And so that is surprising in the American context. At the same time, what's less surprising is that migration is such an important issue on the right in particular, and a weak spot, a moot point on the left. And I think one of the reasons is we've been in a larger crisis of democracy in the last 7 to 8 years at least. I mean, this started with a financial crisis in 2008. The left has been emphasizing the problem of deep inequality and has basically been arguing for redistribution, whereas the right has made this an issue not of top-down, also of anti-elitism, but also of inside-outside. So basically closing the borders as a way to return to some kind of magical and nostalgic past for the true Americans. So there's a re-envisioning of who actually belongs, who is a true American. And oftentimes this is defined on the extreme right as a ethno-national body. So a fantasy of a homogeneous society. I think this is very important to understand this.
We have to leave it there. Boris Foran of Bard College, Berlin. Thank you.
Thanks.
For more on this, I'm joined by Katherine CL Ashbrook. She's a political analyst at the Bertelsmann Foundation think tank in Berlin. Morning, Katherine. President Biden has tried and failed to get Congress to pass a bill to tackle the migration crisis at the U.S. southern border. Why has bipartisan consensus been so hard to reach?
Well, it's actually very simple. It's because the Republicans and particularly presidential candidate Donald Trump have discovered that keeping a southern border insecure keeps it front of mind for voters. And the fact that this is a wedge issue in American politics could give, or so the Republicans believe, them a notch up come the November elections. But what that means is that the situation at the border will remain highly volatile, both for the people who are trying to cross it and for law enforcement who are trying to get some clear regulations on how to behave at the border and in some of the bordering states.
But isn't it a fact that illegal migrant arrivals have actually gone up under the Biden administration when compared to the Trump administration?
Well, they have, but in part because Donald Trump put in very strong border restrictions during the COVID period. And for a number of months, Joe Biden kept those border restrictions in place and then eased them, as would fall in line with some general beliefs of the Democratic Party on expanding and strengthening rights to asylum. But now, of course, the situation has become so dire. We had in December 249,000 attempted crossings. But the political discussion has already changed migrants' minds, quote unquote. We saw a significant drop by 50%, including based on border fortifications and, of course, the heightened political tensions in the United States. So the message seems to be getting through to those would-be migrants or asylum seekers at the U.S. border. But still, many cities, in particular in the United States, feel this to be a very acute crisis.
And now you have reports that President Biden is considering using his executive authority to deny some migrants asylum claims. Has he begun to treat this more as a political problem rather than a humanitarian one?
Well, that's absolutely seeming to be the case. We are heading toward a very hot phase in the U.S. primary election. And what he doesn't want to do is have Donald Trump take this wedge issue and put it front and center as if he were negligent to a problem that the Republicans are framing as the most dire national security issue. We saw senior Republican lawmakers not come to the Munich Security Conference because they made the argument that the real national security issue was at the Texas border and went there to see that. So Biden wants to be seen to be taking a stronger line. He does not want to close the border. But of course, he's going to face backlash within the Democratic Party, particularly the left wing of the Democratic Party. So those plans are by no means set. But the idea is that there would be asylum restrictions to a certain degree and for certain people. But how that's actually going to work out and when that might be put in place, at this point at least, is still entirely unclear.
We were talking about Donald Trump, but Donald Trump has put migration at the center of this presidential campaign, hasn't he? Because now there are reports that he's said to be considering building mass detention camps if elected.
He has, and that has been an issue. That was an issue during his first presidential administration. So despite the fact that the language around detention, and not only detention, deportation camps, he wants to use military helicopters to deport people from detention camps. And of course, for many around the world, that will trigger imagery with historical significance and fits into his ever harshening rhetoric. But at the same time, these are things that he was considering in his first administration, with the help, quote unquote, of his most senior advisor, Stephen Miller, who is truly a radical on these issues with very frightening ideas.
We'll leave it there for the time being, but thanks so much for joining us today. Katherine CL Ashbrook from the Bertelsmann Foundation. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.